Welcome to the Explainer. Normally we'd kick things off with an agenda, but we're going to skip that today. We need to jump straight into a scenario of absolute life and death. We're looking at a massive paradigm shift hidden in a very, very familiar phrase. But to actually grasp it, we have to start far away from ancient texts. We literally need to start right in the middle of a burning building. A few years ago, there was this absolutely striking interview with a structural firefighter. The guy had 20 years on the job, and he said something that completely reframes how we look at survival. When he first started out, he thought staying alive in a fire was all about his own sheer strength. But 2 decades in, he learned this terrifying, yet kind of beautiful truth. He said, what keeps you alive in a fire isn't your own strength, it's the hand of the person behind you checking your oxygen valve. I mean, wow. He explained that firefighters never, ever enter a burning building alone. It is strictly against regulation. It's the foundational life safety rule of their profession. They call it the buddy system, because if you go in alone, you don't come out. So that brings us to a deeply personal, frankly provocative question for you to consider as we go through this explainer today. Who checks your oxygen valve? When you're navigating the fires of life in your own walk of faith, who serves that foundational life safety role for you? Does a name instantly pop into your head? And hey, if no name comes to mind, why is that? Keep that question front and center for me. Section 1. The buddy system, examining our assumptions about faith. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to examine some of our deepest assumptions by looking at 4 famous words from the Apostle Paul that honestly, we generally assume are completely self-explanatory. Work out your own salvation. That's from Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. We hear those 2 words, your own, and we think, right, I know exactly what Paul means here. It sounds incredibly straightforward, doesn't it? But our sources today suggest that we've profoundly misread this text, and that this misreading has dangerously shaped exactly how we live our lives and build our communities. See, when most of us read that text, we immediately interpret salvation as a solo project. We assume it means it's my personal responsibility, my private discipline, my quiet time. And because we're looking through that lens, we end up building relationships that are strictly calculated by cost and benefit. We convince ourselves that leaning on someone else, trusting someone else, is just way too risky. So we tell ourselves it's cleaner, it's safer, maybe it's even more spiritual to just go it alone. But I really have to ask you, does alone actually feel safe? Or does living like that feel a lot more like walking a tightrope, just never quite sure when it might give way beneath you? Moving on to section 2, the plural translation, the detail that changes everything. Now, what's really interesting here is the context. To really set the scene, we have to remember the Apostle Paul wrote this command from a Roman prison, literally the maximum state of human isolation. And that reveals a totally paradigm-shattering reality in the original text. Normally, we read your own as singular and private, a personal to-do list for your soul. But the original Greek text actually uses a plural, communal command. It translates much closer to all of you together, work out the salvation that belongs to you as a community. We have literally been reading a communal command as if it were a private directive. So the crucial point here is that misreading this text, it isn't just some innocent grammatical mistake. Our sources argue that it's actually a symptom of a much, much larger issue. It's the reigning cultural idol of our age, the autonomous self. This is that loud voice in our culture dictating, I decide my own life, I answer to no one, I handle my own business. And this idol slips so quietly into our theology. When we hear work out your own salvation, we are basically hearing permission for exactly the kind of self-contained, self-managed spirituality that our culture trains us to want. We can build this argument even further by looking at the very next verse, Philippians 2:13. Paul writes, "For it is God who works in you." And guess what? That in you is plural again. It's not an individual soul running its own private engine. It is God at work within the whole community, producing shared desires that the community has to work out shoulder to shoulder. Just think about it. Have you recently had a good desire, like a pull to help someone, to reconcile, to serve? Did you automatically assume it was yours to carry completely alone without ever asking someone else to join you? Section 3, the battlefield of community. What working it out actually looks like. Okay, we need to shift gears a bit from translation theory to practical reality. Because if salvation is shared, then the true challenge isn't just your private discipline, it's how you treat the people standing right next to you. And Paul gets incredibly concrete right away in verse 14. He says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. This is fascinating, right? Because churches rarely collapse from massive scandals or giant theological blowups. Not usually. Instead, they slowly, painfully erode from the ordinary grumbling of people who were supposed to be working together as one body. The real battlefield is the everyday friction of community. I want to slow down for just a second here. There's a devastatingly quiet story highlighted in our source material. There was an elder who had served her church faithfully for decades, and she just quietly left. No blow-up argument, nothing. When asked why, she simply said, "Years ago I was in the hospital and no one came. I never got over it." I mean, just sit with the weight of that. One unspoken hurt carried silently for years. She had learned to work out her faith entirely alone, and she never let anyone close enough to repair what had broken. So, how do we combat that kind of quiet isolation? Well, the text points to the cross as the only real ground for laying these grievances down. Listen, we don't forgive because we're just naturally good enough to do it. We forgive from the position of the already forgiven. Christ paid the debt that gave our grudges their legitimacy in the first place. We have to do this together. We have to recognize we are people who owe the exact same debt and have received the exact same mercy. Section 4. A life of gratitude, devotion overflowing in community. And this brilliantly illustrates Paul's own personal confession, showing us just how deeply this communal mindset saturated his own life. In verse 17, Paul writes, "Even if I am poured out as a drink offering, I am glad and rejoice with you all." Now, a drink offering is total, irreversible devotion. Once it's poured out, you can't get it back. Yet Paul faces his own potential death not with dread, but with joy. Why? Because he frames even his most solitary, terrifying act as an act of shared communion. Notice, he says, "with you all." He isn't doing it alone. This brings us to a really beautiful concept in Reformed theology called a life of gratitude. Basically, this means that devotion overflows naturally within a community from a gift you have already received. It is the exact opposite of striving alone to somehow earn your salvation. Serving others in this way is born entirely out of joy. It's not a lonely, heavy obligation to prove your worth. So what does living with this kind of gratitude actually look like in practice? Well, it looks like giving up your time. It means absorbing an inconvenience without constantly keeping score, or taking a loss for the sake of the community. None of this earns salvation, right? It flows from it. Our source material even gives a really specific, local example. It's an invitation for those with grateful hearts to step up and serve on their church's governing body, the consistory. It's essentially an open invitation to stop observing from the sidelines and start working it out together. Let's move to section 5 and see how this all builds. You are not alone. The final challenge. We've traced the text from the original Greek, we've looked at our cultural blind spots, and now we arrive at our closing metaphorical bookend. Consider this profound quote from a retiring lighthouse keeper. He was reflecting on his whole career and he said, "A lighthouse looks like it stands alone. It never does. Someone brought the oil every month. A colleague lit the lamp when I was sick. I love that. It perfectly cements the realization that true independence is an illusion. Work out your own salvation was never a call to walk a lonely road. We are a community entrusted with carrying each other through the absolute darkest storms." So, I want to directly challenge you before you leave this explainer today with 2 reflective steps. Step 1, find who checks your oxygen valve today. If you honestly don't have a name, let today be the day you start actively looking for your buddy system. And step 2, is there a grievance you've been carrying in isolation? Lay it down at the cross right now. Release those quiet grudges so you can actually work life out alongside people, rather than constantly maneuvering around them. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to carry with you. Is there one person you can invite into your salvation today? We must choose trust over our own pride. Our faith was never, ever meant to be a solo project. I challenge you to boldly say to someone this week, "I don't want to do this alone anymore." Thank you so much for joining me, and I really hope this changes how you work it out moving forward.